So it leads to inane, bizarre, strange things like the USDA food pyramid that argue that this grain, wheat, and by the way, when I talk about grain, I really mean wheat. So for most people, this is an exceptional crew. Let's put aside this exceptional crew. When people talk about grains, they're really talking about wheat, right? They're not talking about quinoa. They're not talking about millet or sorghum. They're talking about wheat for the most part. And wheat has come to populate 20% of all human calories. So it's a big, big piece of human consumption. So we have the USDA telling us that wheat should form the cornerstone, the biggest part of our diet, the revised food plate. Likewise, grains is the biggest piece of our diet. So they're telling us that we should be eating grains breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Well, maybe scam is too strong a word, but I think we've been given bum advice. I think this is not true. I think it's very bad. It's not just ineffective. You know, if it was neutral, didn't do anything bad, that'd be bad enough. But I'm going to argue that it's actually quite destructive. And so I call this a scam. And that's not Dr. John Briffett before his hair transplant. That's Bernie Madoff, of course, who made off with billions of dollars of other people's money. So we won't get too much into that whole issue of just how much of this was on purpose, how much is already known, and how much is still propagated on an unwitting public without their knowledge. But I believe we could argue, I believe with some persuasiveness, that some of this has been known for many years. So what is different? So what? So we got wheat that's short, stocky, big seed head, tenfold greater yield. Who cares? If it's bread, it's still bread, right? Who cares? Well, there are changes. Now, we don't have all the changes mapped out because if there's this basic fundamental assumption that no matter how extreme or bizarre the change is introduced into a plant, it's still suitable for human consumption, what we don't have is extensive testing to understand what's in these new strains. So if we went to the developer, say, of glyphosate-resistant corn and said, tell us what's in there, they're going to say, oh, it's just corn, right? You won't get a detailed analysis, genetics, biochemistry, etc. So we don't have everything mapped out. And by the way, just so you know, so hybridization is often dismissed as a benign phenomenon. That is just crossing two plants. But if you hybridize, let's say, mommy plant and daddy plant, 5% of the genetics in that offspring plant are unique to that offspring. So if I took any one of you and looked at your mom and looked at your dad, you're not an exact duplicate of either. You're not a perfect mix of 50-50 of mom and dad. You are some of mom, some of dad, and many of your own unique characteristics neither have. Maybe you play drums and mom and dad had tin ears, right? So hybridization involves the introduction of unique characteristics. But anyway, so let's talk about the gliadin protein. If there's one issue you remember in wheat beyond its incredible change at the hands of genetics research, it's to understand what gliadin is. So gliadin protein is a smaller protein within gluten. So the world is talking about gluten, but gluten is really not the issue. It's gliadin. Okay? So a quick lesson in wheat and dough. So if you make bread dough, what gives it that cohesiveness? Glutenin. Okay? The polymerized protein called glutenin in gluten. Okay? The stuff that allows a pizza maker to do that, where he twirls the dough above his head. Nothing else can do that, right? If you did that with cornstarch, what happens? You have a mess. There's nothing else that has that unique viscoelastic property of the glutenin polymer in wheat. So glutenin is that thing that confers that unique viscoelastic property, and there's gliadin, okay? Now, gliadins have changed. We know this for an absolute fact. One of the changes mapped out in the gliadin protein is a sequence called GLIA alpha 9. We know that this so-called GLIA alpha 9 sequence is present in most modern forms of wheat. It is absent in most older forms of wheat. So you won't find it in the wheat of 1950. You won't find it in the wheat of the Bible, Emmer. You won't find it in einkorn. You won't find it in kamut or spelt. So this unique, slightly altered form of gliadin is different from the traditional forms of gliadin. It's probably the reason why we've had a fourfold increase in celiac disease. Now, most of you here do not have celiac disease, and this is not a conversation about celiac disease, but I think we can use that as the canary in the coal mine effect. If there's been a big change introduced into the gliadin protein sufficient to quadruple the incidence of celiac disease over the last 50 years, there's something fundamentally and importantly different in this gliadin protein. It's been known for over a century that if you expose laboratory animals to opiates like heroin, morphine, OxyContin, you get appetite stimulation. So if you give your laboratory animals morphine, they're going to eat more and get fat. So this question was raised by a research group at the National Institutes of Health by Christine Zedrow, and that is, are there opiates in foods? Now, she didn't start to try to find out if wheat was an opiate. She wanted to understand why. There were several psychiatric groups in the US, the UK, who raised this issue. This was the day in the 60s of closed psychiatric wards and closed hospital wards, where you'd go into a hospital ward and there'd be 30 or 40 people in a room. So now we have private rooms and all that, but back then 30, 40 patients in a room. And in psychiatric units, the diet, the drugs were controlled. So several psychiatric groups made this observation. If we take people with paranoid schizophrenia, so these are very ill people. They have a difficult time engaging with other people. They hallucinate voices. They have a hard time looking you in the eye and engaging you in conversation. And they, for all practical purposes, do not lead normal lives. And so these inpatients in these psychiatric units had their diets controlled. And when they removed wheat, all wheat, many of those phenomena got better. They weren't cured. They just got a bit better. They had less hallucinations. They were able to socially engage better, etc. If you add wheat back over several weeks, they got worse. If you took wheat away again, they got better. If you added it back, they got on again, off again, on again, off again. They could recreate this phenomenon. This was corroborated by other psychiatric groups. So this group at the NIH asked, why? What the heck is in wheat that causes a person with paranoid schizophrenia to hear voices? Like Son of Sam being told to shoot his neighbors by his dog. So they subjected the gliadin protein to digestion and found that the digestive products could cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to the opiate receptors of the brain. Gliadin is an opiate. Okay? So gliadin is an opiate. Wheat is an opiate. That's the problem here. So opiates cause appetite stimulation. Wheat causes appetite stimulation. This simple observation, by the way, casein, one of the proteins in dairy does also, but the affinity, the strength of the binding to the opiate receptor is so weak, that's not really an issue. I think there are some people who might be prone to that effect, but it's such a non-issue for most people. I bring that up because the wheat lobby says, well, dairy, spinach, and broccoli are addictive too. No, they're not.